Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this Helios webinar, Practicing with Purpose, presented by the Coaches Site. I'm Derek Jory, Director of Content with the Coaches Site. It goes without saying that in hockey, practice is where true development happens, yet many coaches still rely on intuition or the eye test when deciding what works. With rising ice costs and limited ice time, we cannot afford to let any sessions drift without intention. Today, we're joined by JP Buckley, Vice President of Sales and Business Development at Helios Hockey. With over 15 years of experience in sports video and analytics, including roles with the Boston University Terriers, Nashville Predators, and Boston Bruins, JP brings a wealth of knowledge to the table. He'll guide us through how leveraging advanced time on ice metrics can transform coaching by helping design drills that balance intensity and rest, optimize recovery, improve bench management, and provide more actionable feedback. Whether you coach youth, club, college, or elite players, this session will give you practical insights to make every minute on the ice count. Let's dive in and learn how to practice with purpose. If you have a question during this session, please put it in the chat. Take it away, JP.
Thanks, Derek. And thank you for having us. I think what TCS has been able to build in terms of a coaching community has just been incredible, a place where we can all come together and hone our skills and share ideas to become better coaches and ultimately to help our players develop into better athletes. One of the things that I really like about TCS, some of the content I've been getting on my feed recently, is around all the different practice drill ideas that get shared. I was just watching one before I jumped on the call, which was in the D-zone coverage practice. And so we're sharing all these ideas as coaches. We're constantly looking for ways to design better practices because we know the importance of it. Whether you're at the NHL level and you're really using it to make sure your players stay in fitness and work on game strategy and be able to perform, or you're at the youth level and you're really using your practice time to develop and teach the game of hockey, we all know the value of practice. What we've found is that there's just a lack of data that's being used to help us understand as coaches what the impact of our practices are and get a feedback loop to help us hold ourselves accountable and continue to improve in that way. Working at the Boston Bruins with several elite coaching staffs and incredible teams, I noticed that our coaches always got together and we were getting creative on how do we build this practice, what is the impact and objective of this drill, and we would spend a lot of time trying to build the drills that were helping us and helping our teams. But then we would not have many tools that would help us figure out, well, did we hit our objective? And at the higher levels, and as hockey has evolved, analytics have become such an important part of the game, where we're using it in the game environments to understand how well did we execute on strategy, and we have all these expected goals and Corsi percentages to understand performance. And then when we go to the practice side, there really isn't a lot available for us. And so with evolutions in technology, there are now solutions where we can actually measure our practice and help our coaches and help us develop our players in a more intentional way. And so at the higher levels, every level you go, there's a different objective for your practices. Sometimes you practice more than you play in games. At the professional level, you're playing more games. What we see as a problem more in the amateur, youth, AAA, high school, sub-professional level is that there's limited ice time available, and the cost of ice time is getting incredibly expensive. The cost to play hockey is getting incredibly expensive. And so as coaches, it's our responsibility to make sure that we're maximizing that time on ice so that we're making sure that our players are getting the necessary development or training or whatever that objective is. And without measuring it, we're leaving ourselves at risk. At the youth level, we're practicing significantly more than we're playing games, 2 to 3 times more. And there are no tools that are helping coaches understand what's the impact of this practice. How hard were my players working or skating on the ice? We're obsessed with game analytics, but we completely ignore the practice side, and we believe that should change. As we mentioned, at the younger levels, like development happens in practice. We need to make sure that we're using and maximizing our ice time to help our hockey players become better athletes. And that's our job as coaches. It's to make sure that we're designing drills, designing practices that are making sure our players are skating and moving so that we're maximizing our time on ice. There's a lot of coaches and a lot of drills that leave players standing around, leave, too much time at the boards, too much time with instruction. And while that is important, there's a balance between making sure that we're keeping practices fun and players are skating and moving around. And so what's the return? At the younger levels and at all levels, we're investing a significant amount of time and money into making sure that our players are traveling all over the place and playing at the highest levels. And we're going to different skating coaches and power skating and skills coaches outside of our additional team, and we're playing hockey year round. And so we're spending a lot of time on the ice, and we question, what is the return on that? How can we actually measure the effectiveness of all the time and resources we're putting in to our players' development if we're not measuring it with analytics in those practice sessions? And so we could talk a little bit about that. There's a lot of information out there. USA Hockey, Hockey Canada have put out development models with the intention of helping coaches understand at different levels, what type of skating time versus rest time is helpful for players. Some say it's a 1-to-1, a 2-to-1, or even a 3-to-1 rest to work ratio. And so there are guidelines for this. We want to be sure that we're not overworking players or underworking players. How do we design practices that are making sure it's fun and everyone's moving with small area games and station-based games? And so with all this stuff happening on the ice in practice, it's hard for a coach to understand, well, what was the impact of this practice? How well did I do executing on my practice plan? What was the impact of that workload on my players? And so if you're not measuring, I've heard stories of people doing stopwatches on the ice to try and measure the effectiveness of it. And that's really hard when you don't have a lot of resources and when you're trying to manage a whole entire group. Maybe it's young players and it could be like herding cats at points. So there are guidelines out there. And as I alluded to in the beginning, there's a lot of information being put out and a lot of time being invested by coaches to help structure different drills and get creative to maximize that ice time. And what we're hoping for is to close that feedback loop. So let's say you go out into that practice and you actually run those drills. And then you come off the ice and you're just relying on gut feel or intuition to figure out, was that hard? Did I execute that drill for long enough? Were my players getting sufficient movement on the ice? And then, was that a hard practice? And what do we mean by hard? Is it because there was a lot of skating or because there was a lot of battle? And so when we're purely relying on gut intuition as the feedback loop to how well we're doing, we're introducing a lot of bias and a lot of subjectivity that's hurting our ability to know the truth and to be able to iterate on our own practices, on our own coaching techniques to help make sure that we're maximizing that practice and ice time. Gut feel, as we've talked about both at TCS and just I think the wave of analytics coming into the sport, is not enough. Guesswork is not enough. When we're guessing, we're not knowing, and when we're not knowing, we're not putting our teams in positions to win and our players in positions to perform. And so there's also a lot of analytics systems out there and tools and video platforms that are designed for game use. So we can get shifts broken down. We can look at our face-off percentages, but then again, there's a vacuum when it comes to practices. And so when we're knowing the importance of practice, spending so much time practicing, but not having objective data to help us understand the impact of those practices, then there's a huge gap. And I see it. I was on a Reddit thread last night where we were going through all these coaches talking about their practices and what is the proper work to recovery ratio. And most coaches overestimate our practices. We overestimate the amount of time the players are actually skating. And without technology and data collection to help us understand the truth, then we're always going to be off one way or the other. And so one of those things is, yes, you might have a player that's in a drill skating and working, but how much of that is coasting versus gliding and kind of standing still versus high workload type skating? And how much percentage of your drill is going into real skating versus standing in line and coasting? How does this practice or this drill impact forwards versus defensemen versus a goalie. And so there's just a lot of nuance to the practice and the drill that is almost impossible to understand purely from our own eye test, especially when you're following, multi-station type practices or flow practices and your coaches are working with players on the side. If we can't optimize what we can't measure. And so there's opportunities now at the NHL level. They're starting to get more and more into wearable data to help understand workload on players. And we believe that this is important to start coming down into the sub-professional amateur market because we're on the ice even more and practices are even more important. And so what happens when you don't measure your practices? You can put yourselves at risk. So as coaches, it's our responsibility to make sure that our players are in a position to perform at the highest level. And it's also our responsibility to make sure that our coaches are not overtraining or undertraining our players and putting them at risk for injury or, again, putting them at risk for not being able to perform. And so lack of clarity on what we would call player load and load management is a huge missed opportunity by just relying off eye test alone, because you can cause a lot of damage to your team and your players by not understanding the impact of your practices on the body and on their ability to perform. Disconnected plans, especially at the lower levels, again, you need to be using data and analytics or using your practice time to make sure that your players are getting the most performance and effort. And so if you're not measuring your practices and you don't know how much time did I spend standing at the boards, how much time did my players spend in a drill waiting in line to go versus actually going, and are they not getting enough development time in the practice plan, that's putting them at risk for underdevelopment. Ineffective drills, we see this a lot. It would be great, some of the drills that we see getting posted on TCS or the drills that we run in practice, we have this idea for, how much movement, how much skating, how intense are they, what is the density of this training volume. But to have data to back that up would be closing the feedback loop. And so we see it a lot, especially at the younger levels, but this happens at all levels, where you run a drill that you think is very high intensity, high skating. But what you don't realize is that there's only 2 or 3 players participating in that drill at any given time. The rest of them are standing in line. Or you have a drill that's heavy on the defenseman and the forwards aren't getting a lot of work. And so over the course of a practice, you could have a very big mismatch to what you thought was happening with this drill versus what actually ended up happening. And with data, we can close that loop and allow you to iterate on your practice designs and your drill designs to make sure that you're getting full effort and full performance out of your players. And then the performance impact. Again, we talk with coaches and there's a game where your players they didn't have legs, they looked slow, they weren't working, and we can get upset about that. If we have data to show how well did I do as a coach over the course of this last week of practice to make sure that I was putting my players in the perfect rest and work ratio, that when they step on the ice for the game time, they're ready to perform. If we overtrain them throughout the course of a week or over the course of several weeks where we're just in too high of a workload state of training, then they go out onto the ice and they're tired and they're not moving and they're not skating as hard. The responsibility is on us as coaches. And it's easy to blame the players and say, oh, they're not working, they're not skating. Let's go back into practice and I'm going to skate them even harder. Well, that's just further perpetuating this overtraining loop, which is going to put them in positions to be hurt. And so performance impact on your practices impact how they play in games. And so finding that perfect balance and structure over the course of a week to make sure that you're putting your team in the best position to win games is critical, and it's on us. And you only can do that if you're actually measuring and optimizing. And I know at first you might think this is stuff they should do at the NHL level or at the D1 level. It's too much down the youth level. Well, being part of the youth hockey ecosystem for the last several years now, coming down from the NHL level, it was amazing to see how hard and how often players were on the ice around the season, training multiple sessions a day. And so if you're on the ice that much, then there's a certain impact on your body. And we need to be a little bit smarter. This idea of more is better is not putting our kids in the best position to develop into future athletes. And you can see the impact of it already today with hip injuries and surgeries at young age and burnout by players and decreases in players continuing to play hockey into their older ages. And so we need to be able to monitor our performance and make sure we're optimizing so that kids can have fun, so that we can develop, and so that we can win games as coaches. So this idea of training smarter, not just harder, we sort of got into that a little bit. But, in the youth space, there's teams that are going and playing 5 games in a weekend. And so there's a certain amount of workload that's being put on the body of those players. And if we're not careful with how we're designing practices to make sure that we're allowing certain recovery states to come in and maybe mixing in like a hard practice with a more instructional recovery-based practice to allow them to get back into a state of healthy training volume, then we're risking overtraining and injury and lack of performance. And so our job as coaches is to make sure that our players are optimized for performance come game day. And if we're not understanding with data and with video how our practices over the course of that week was and what the impact of our first line versus third line guys was, then we're in trouble. The opposite can happen where if we're under training, if coach thinks that our practices are very hard and when we look at the data, they're actually not, your players aren't skating enough. They're not getting the same amount of training volume that they would get in games. So they're undertrained, and when they go to perform in a game, they can't compete. They can't sustain performance into the third period because they're not used to that amount of training. And again, if you're not measuring both games and practices for this type of information, then you don't know what's happening with your team and you won't know how to fix it. That goes into the analyzing fatigue with precision, and then individualized development. At the higher levels, when you have players who you're not rolling the bench, playing 4 lines, there's players who get more reps in practice, whether they're on first line power play or not. They're playing power play and penalty kill versus your fourth line guys. Each player has a different requirement for their amount of training and volume that they need. And so, again, you can use wearable technology, other technology to help understand, the impact of practice and games on an individual player and give them custom individualized development plans to make sure that they're optimized for performance, they're optimized for the role that they're in. Injury prevention is a huge topic, especially as we start getting up into junior college, professional sports. We want to make sure that we're not hurting players. And again, that goes back into sudden spikes in training workload puts players at risk for injury. So again, if you're not practicing at the same volumes that you would play in a game, that's going to put you at risk for injury. If you're overtraining and then you go into a game, you're also your muscles and your body are not going to be able to sustain that. You're putting yourself at risk for injury. Avoid undertraining. We've covered that, and just communication. Players, it's an interesting thing when you're working with a player who wants to be out there on the ice. They want to work hard. They want to continue to perform, and they think I need to be out there every single second, putting work into my game on the ice. And you try to tell them, hey, we need to give a recovery day. We need to maybe tailor it. Don't go on the ice for a morning shift, or let's have a lighter skate day. If there's no data, it's very hard to communicate back and forth with that. But if you can show players, especially players in today's day and age, who are used to being on apps, who are used to data, who have wearables already for their sleep and their recovery, these players want information. They want the coach to be using information to help communicate that to them. Otherwise, it's going to create friction points where it's just coach telling a player he's working too hard or he's not working hard enough. And with data and with an app experience, you can really help bridge that gap and create more alignment with players. So I wanted to show just a couple examples within the Helios system on how a different practice plan can look and how hard it would be to really understand this volume or this detail as a coach without having some sort of report. So we provide 2 reports here at Helios for coaches that run practice sessions. One is a practice intensity report, which is measuring only the stride time that you've spent relative to the whole entire session length. And so it's not coasting, gliding, it's not light skates, it's not shuffling, standing at the board, standing in line. It's only the times that you spent in a full stride interval, high workload type training from a skating standpoint. We measure that for all of your players for forwards and D, and we give you a percentage. We also measure player load. So what is the density or volume of this training, and what was the impact on each one of your different players? So we give you a load score and then a load per minute. And so in this first graph, you see a little bit hard to see here, but it's a low skating volume, but a high load. So they came in at under 10% for their skating volume, which is shocking to a lot of people. A lot of coaches, especially in that Reddit thread that I was just reading, think that their players are moving and skating for 50 minutes out of a 60-minute ice sheet. And that's not the reality. When you actually have skating data, you can see how little true skating, high intensity workload you get over the course of the practice. And if you're not very intentional with the drills that you design, you could wind up only getting 10 minutes of skating over the course of the 60-minute sheet of ice. You might have additional time shuffling and coasting and kind of floating around, but high workload type skating is a much smaller metric. And so this team in the front here, they came in at sub 10 practice intensity, but their workload was very high. As you can see, all their players have a load per minute that is surpassing their actual load that they got for that practice. And so what I see in this is a practice that was probably a lot of small area games, a lot of battle in the corners, not a lot of open ice skating where you're doing laps and you're going end-to-end flow drills, breakouts into forechecks, 5-man units. It was probably more of a small ice station-based game, but there was a lot of work and a lot of battle going into that. And so it's important to see how different drills can impact both sides of the spectrum. In the middle, we have high skating volume and a high skating load. And so this is, I think they finished up at around a 16%, which means 16% of the time they spent in a full skating interval. Their total time on ice and total active time would probably be higher, up into the 30s or 40s or 50s, depending on the practice, but their actual skating time was much lower. For us, 16% is a pretty high intensity type of practice from a skating standpoint, and their load was also high. So this was a very hard practice on the players. You don't want to run this type of practice 5 days out of the week and then go in to play a game because your players are going to be too tired. And so it's important to know, what drills allowed this practice to be both high in both categories, and was that the intention of our practice? Is that the objective we were trying to hit? And what day of the week were we running this practice to make sure we're allowing time to recover before game time? On the right-hand side, you see the opposite of that. It's a low skating volume and a low load. So easy practice from a training intensity standpoint, and a very light skate type practice in terms of skating. I think they came in at under 9, and then they only had about 80 load score across the board. And so this would be a great practice that you were running if it was a recovery-based skate. Your players had come off of a weekend of a lot of training and you wanted to give them a recovery-based day, or this is the day before a game, so you're giving them a chance to recover, or a morning skate. The problem is that too often coaches will think that they ran a very hard practice and their scores will look like this. And we have to have conversations with coaches about, why do you think that practice was so hard on the players, and is there misalignment with what you think is happening on the ice in your drills versus what's actually happening? And if you go through a whole season without really knowing, then you might have a team that continues to go out onto the ice and underperforms and gets blown out from a skating and intensity standpoint because they're just not used to training at that level. And the coach will be confused, players will be frustrated, because no one really knows what's going on. With data and these reports, you'll be able to quickly assess your practices and make sure that you're building an optimized training model for your players. And so we've talked about this today. I think, as coaches, it's our responsibility today to bring in and integrate some of these tools. Gone are the days where we can just say, I've got the gut feel, intuition, I know what's going on. My job is to just win games. You have to be able to manage load, manage intensity, manage development plans for your players, integrate this sort of technology to be able to be the best coach you can be and to put your players in the best position to develop. it's kind of, we always thought like at the higher levels you have a strength and conditioning coach. At the NHL level they have, PhD sports scientists, and this was stuff that was pretty much inaccessible down market. I don't have the time, I don't have the technical know-how to do this. We don't have the budget to be able to implement technologies like this. Yes, I want to have it, but I just can't do it. A lot of that has changed just with the advent of wearable technology and being able to offer it to youth teams, and specifically designed for coaches who might not have that deep background, might not have a bunch of staff on hand to break down all this stuff. It's available at your fingertips in hockey terminology that you can understand and you can iterate on. And how our platform works is we do this from a wearable device. The wearable allows us to get very granular metrics on your skating performance. And so we can pull, the difference between a high intensity skating and a low intensity skating. We can pull high density workload training versus low workload training because we have very accurate data from the core sensor itself. This funnels into dashboards and reports for coaches and players. As I was talking about before with Derek when we got on, the players nowadays want this type of information. They're used to looking at apps. They're used to looking at data. They want to see how they're performing. They're motivated by data and video. Video is the next evolution of all of this. Historically, I've never had teams at any level really breaking down game video because it was hard to do, and the resources involved in doing that. Because we have wearable data and we can plug in with video systems, we can automatically cut individual drill runs for players. So now they don't only have to watch their shifts, they can also watch their practice drill runs if they want. And the coach can go back and review, why did my practice have low intensity and low skating? I thought that was a hard practice. Let me quickly go in without needing to do anything except run your practice session and upload your video, be able to watch your drills back and to say, okay, I think, maybe the players that were in the drill were really working hard and skating, but a lot of them were standing around waiting to go, and that's not optimized. So how can I change things? So integrating video into a system that's both designed for the average hockey coach to understand and for the average team who doesn't have significant resources is an option for you now. We've had the fortunate opportunity to work with the Youngstown Phantoms in the USHL. Coach Ryan Ward, he is incredibly forward-thinking. He's always looking for a competitive advantage. He is not resting on just his eye test. And he's a guy who has a very keen eye for the game of hockey. He has great intuition for players and performance. But even he'll admit, and some of our other coaches that I've worked for, Butch Cassidy, who I think is probably one of the smartest hockey coaches that I've been around, he oftentimes would go back and look at the analytics and look at the video, and that would change maybe how he initially thought of, an individual player or team performance after the game. And Ryan's a very similar way. And so this quote I thought was really powerful. Knowing exactly how hard players work takes the guesswork out of coaching by understanding the analytics in the wearable. We can now dial in training, keep players fresh, and hit peak performance when it matters most. Data-driven decisions make us a better team every single day. And so that's a coach who has figured out, how to incorporate some of this data into his program. And he's done that with practice sessions, running practice on Helios, where we just automatically capture the data coming out of the wearable and feeding that to the coaches where they can monitor load in real time and make sure they're not exceeding or underperforming on their intention. Practice video. Today, we recently launched the ability for you to upload practice film, and because we understand, what drills you're running through the drill library that you can build out, and when the players are wearing that wearable, when they're participating in that drill, you can actually cut all of your drill run video, and we can have data that tells the coach, this practice, this drill that you ran, here's the impact of it. Here's the workload. Here's the average duration that you ran it for. Here's the average speeds that you ran it for. And then when you start building practices, you have data backed drill library that you can use to build the best practices to make sure that you're hitting your objective, whatever that happens to be, high intensity, low intensity, long practice, short practice. You have data. So now there's no guesswork and the feedback loop has been closed. And the final piece here, practice is where you win. This is where you're building your team and making sure that they're ready to compete and perform. That's where you're training them on the skills of hockey. You're training them on executing on game strategy, on chemistry with each other, bringing them together as a team. So how we practice is important. It drives development. It's time for us to measure it. We don't need to be spending all of our time and money investing and going to the rink and not having any idea on what's happening when we're out there on the ice. And Helios makes that easy to close that feedback loop for people at all levels. So I appreciate the opportunity to present to you all. I hope you got something out of that. And I think we got a couple questions in here that I'll help answer. Let's see. The first one that came in, how does a team with limited resources approach analytics and practice? This is a good question. It's something we get a lot. We've got a lot to do as coaches, especially maybe as a AAA, U15 team. We got volunteer coaches and we don't have strength and conditioning coaches. It can be challenging. And so with our system, we've designed it to be very light. So it runs through an iPad. You start a session, you end the session at the end in 2 clicks, and then all of the data gets synced up into the coaching suite where you see automated reports and dashboards. So you can literally just, with the click of 2 buttons and then coming in afterwards, you can see all this information in terms that you can understand. And so you don't need to have huge staffs anymore to be able to run some of this. Can you explain how to incorporate video with this? Yeah, absolutely. So on the practice side, there's 2 ways that you can bring in video. The first one is simply if you're working out of Live Barn, if you're filming it on an iPad, if you have a Pixelot camera, however you are collecting your video, we have various levels of integrations with those systems where you can bring that video into our portal. And from there, if it's aligned to the practice data, essentially instantly all of your drill runs for all your players will be cut. There's a second level of that for more of the elite teams that might have additional resources where you build out your drill library in our system. In the practice, you can actually tag when this drill started and what drill it was and when that drill ended. And so you have a running log of your practice and your drill. And when you upload video after the practice is over for that version, we'll again cut all of the players' drills and we'll cut the drill for the coach instantly and automatically so that you can run that back and see how different practices or different players performed. And then your players will also see their drill runs in the app. Does it capture any biometrics like heart rate? So Helios itself is not a heart rate sensor. We're worn on the chest protector, and so we're not touching the skin. So we track what we would call external load. Other systems, like if you have a Whoop or if you wear polar straps that are collecting your internal load, we can integrate those into our system. So not natively a biometric sensor, but we do bring internal load to the external load that we're collecting. How does the system detect how hard a practice is? That's a good question. So we do this in a variety of different ways. I'd say the 2 primary ways is we look at skating volume and then we look at workload. And so we want to understand, you have a 60-minute sheet of ice, how much of that time are players actually skating? And so we have 2 levels of time on ice information. One is a broader calculation of just purely any skating activity that we detect, whether it's shuffling, coasting, gliding, light skates versus really bursty sprints, hard, strides that you're taking. And so we measure both of those and we provide different reports on what percentage of the practice was full hard skating versus light skating, or what was the percentage of practice that was just total skating. And you can monitor that over the course of the season to see how they develop and how your practices yield different types of skating volumes. The other piece is workload. So as we talked about in one of those slides, you could have a practice that's low in skating, but it's taken a huge toll on players because there's a lot of battle drills or in the corner type drills, a lot of start and stops, and you're jumping on loose pucks. and you might not be open end skating, but you're really working hard. And so we measure that through a workload calculation through our sensor. Been using the system for a month plus with our team. Is there a cheat sheet to help parents understand the data reflected in the app? Fielding so many questions from parents. Yeah, as we present and we introduce new technology and new analytics at different levels, there's going to be a lot of training and education that has to happen. And so we have a variety of different resources, both on our website, and if you reach out to me directly after this, we can get you situated. It's new technology. Parents might not be, especially if they didn't play the game and they haven't been around, sports analytics for a while. They might not truly understand, what is this data telling me and how can I use it? But we have a lot of resources out there, and I'm happy to jump on a call with anyone at any time to walk you through that. But thank you for being a customer. And the last one here, general question on pitching this approach to old school coaches, maybe weaving into the game value too, or maybe communicating that these data points over time provide even more value. Yeah, this is a good question. We were talking about this before we got on the call. There are some coaches that are in that old school, I don't need technology, I don't need video, I know what's going on, I don't need data and analytics, it's too much. And I think there's going to be, as this data becomes more and more prevalent at various levels, that approach is going to hurt that coach's ability to relate to players, and it's going to hurt his ability to perform. Today's day and age, parents want to send their kids to teams that have a coach that are integrating technology, that are what they feel is providing them with the best tools to become the best player, to continue their development and to play at higher and higher levels and to hopefully go to the NHL at the end of the day. And so if you're an organization who is resistant to the latest player development tools and technologies, I think you'll have a hard time convincing parents that this is the best place to be, because we're monitoring all of your performance, and we're monitoring my performance to make sure that I'm putting your kids in the best position to perform. The game value is incredible. Automated time on ice. How hard are our players working? There's a variety of different analytics, both in terms of allowing coach to understand individualized development needs and then tracking that over the course of the season, to just generally putting your team in a position to win games. And so there's a lot of ways we can chat with old school coaches to try and bring them around on some of this data. And I'm happy to talk with you about that as well. I think that's all the questions we got. And so again, thank you for having me on. Thank you to TCS and Derek and Justin and Aaron. We love what you guys are building, and we're grateful to be part of the community.